Okay, we're good to go.
We've moved from room 19 into a different part of room 19, which is technically room 14. And these numbers that you see behind me were produced many years ago by James Moseley, the librarian, using metal French stencils. In fact, all of the stacks you see behind me, because the little panel is so small, James couldn't fit the whole number in. So this is 1451, 1452, 1455 and so on. Room 14 contains more books, but also things like trade union records and a large number of periodicals going way, way back. Also in this room, there are several boxes of ephemera. I say several, just looking across there, 15, maybe 20. And this is one of my favourite pieces. It is a poster for the Japanese village. It's printed by colour lithography, probably from stone litho plates, at least half a dozen, perhaps slightly more. And it's produced on quite good quality paper. So it has survived very well from 1885, when this was first printed. Japanese village is something that very few people know about, although the descendants of some of the original residents are still living here in London. In January 1885, January the 10th, the village opened its doors to the people of London, admission 1 shilling or 6pence for children, and it was a fully fledged Japanese village populated by 100 Japanese immigrants who were brought to this country by the organiser, a tea and silk importer, a man called Tanaka Bohikro-san, who lived in Putney with his wife Oteka-san. And this was a business venture at a time when unemployment in Japan was particularly high and all sorts of people were struggling to find employment, including artisans and performers, acrobats, and they were the individuals which Tanaka Bohikro-san brought to London, people who could actually put on some sort of a show. The village was a huge success. Between January the 10th and its temporary closure in May the same year, around 250,000 people came to Gorp. It wasn't really a human zoo, although that might seem to be what it was. In fact, everybody was there perfectly happily. They were paid a salary, they received expenses, their food was provided, board and lodgings were provided. The contract with all the residents was for 3 years, and it included allowances for laundry and, perhaps a little surprisingly, a haircutting allowance too. Quite why that was included, I'm not sure. The village was destroyed in a fire in May 1885. But it was quite a timely intervention because it was always intended that after 3 or 4 months, the artisans, the acrobats, would go on a tour of Europe. And so as soon as the village was wiped out, Tanaka Bohikro-san took his team to Berlin and then to Munich and to various other European venues, which allowed time for that village to be rebuilt. This is a glorious piece of printing. It's beautiful, the colours are still vibrant. It's a great personal favourite of mine. And it illustrates a particular kind of printing. Why do we have it? Well, St Bride Printing School was here from 1895 until 1922, when it moved south of the river to become the London School of Printing and Kindred Trades. There were huge collections of printed ephemera to show the students various printing processes, various techniques. So we still have to this day examples of some very obscure printing processes, such as gypsography, which involved engraving a slab of plaster of Paris and using those incised lines to produce a printing plate from type metal. And there are lots of other processes and techniques that we can still find examples for here at St Bride. Pardon me. We also have, in the same collection, this, and it is again the Japanese village, but this is a very different kind of poster. This one is printed letterpress, in the letterpress printer's traditional colour palette of black and red. It's a much cruder design, but it does show the acrobats and some of the performers. It's printed on wood pulp. Now, wood pulp is the curse of archivists because really from the second half of the 19th century it became used very widely, not just for newspapers, but for all sorts of cheap printing. You can see from the colour of this, which would have been white when it was first produced, it's a sort of tobacco brown. and that's a consequence of the lignin in the wood fibres, which has caused it to deteriorate. Wood pulp disintegrates and deteriorates much more rapidly when it's exposed to sunlight, or indeed any kind of light. But this is quite a vibrant poster. It's, as I say, much cruder. It's an eye-catching design, and this, I think, was produced for the revival of the Japanese village. It opened again in December 1885, about 7 months after it was destroyed in the blaze, and it continued until 1887. It was so successful, and you have to remember at the time that there was an obsession amongst the Victorians with anything Oriental, in the same way that in the 1920s there was a fascination with Egyptian and Egyptology, artifacts and events. In the late 19th century, we had a fascination with the Orient. It was a place of mystery, and that's perhaps why the Japanese village was so popular. If you went there, there was a main street. You could visit the shops, you could buy souvenirs, a handmade Japanese fan, ceramics, examples of Japanese calligraphy. You could even have a tattoo of a snake. There was a resident tattoo artist who would decorate you with something rather more permanent than some of the things you could buy. And there was a 300-seat theatre where you could go and watch extracts from kabuki plays, and you could watch the musicians, performers, acrobats. It's something, I think, which probably still has legs today. And we have examples. I suppose in modern terms, the Japanese village was a cross between Harry Potter World and Thorpe Park. It was a day out, an entertaining day out for Victorian families. As I said, I think earlier, Queen Victoria was a fan. Gilbert and Sullivan visited as well, and it's been suggested that the Japanese village was the inspiration for the Mikado. In fact, the libretto for the Mikado was already in preparation before the village opened its doors. Although there are some pictures of Gilbert and Sullivan visiting the village during the time that it was open. So just 2 items from an enormous collection of printed ephemera, very little of which sees the light of day, and I'm sorry to say very little of which is actually catalogued, but hopefully in the years to come we'll be able to produce some sort of online catalogue to allow people to browse some of this material. Meanwhile, I would just say enjoy these 2.